What's up, guys? Back with another educational video, and this week, just when you thought it was safe to take in artificial sweeteners again, a new study's published. But first, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment for the algorithm. I know when this study got published because it got sent to me by no less than probably 100 people. And I know Andrew Huberman tweeted about it and actually tagged me in it. And so I hadn't had a chance to look at it until just today. It is a pretty cool study, to be honest. So this study was published in Cell. Cell is a reputable journal, although I will say I have read some absolute crud get published in Cell. Now, I don't think this study was crud. I think it was actually pretty good. But it's a study out of Israel, and what they did was compared 4 different artificial sweeteners, or actually technically not artificial because they included stevia. So they called it non-nutritive sweeteners. So they compared sucralose, aspartame, saccharin, and stevia. They were looking at the gut microbiome, they were looking at insulin, GLP-1, and they actually looked at a bunch of different TCA cycle intermediates and some stuff that we're not going to cover because it's just too technical and we'd lose the main theme of this paper. So they were comparing these non-nutritive sweeteners, good first step, humans, and they were in dosages that are within the acceptable daily intake range. So they weren't just like blasting people with super high doses. So that's also a good check mark in this study's corner. The other thing was they had over 100 people in the study. So for a randomized control trial, it was well powered, which a power calculation is basically, you look at what we hypothesize will be the difference. If we want to detect that difference, based on the variability that's seen in these various studies, looking at these markers, how many subjects are we going to need in order to be able to detect that difference? And so that's kind of the basis of a power calculation. So I looked at the power calculation, it was solid, and the amount of people they recruited for the study was good. Basically, they had people kind of run in on a baseline for 7 days, and then for 2 weeks, had them either consume one of the 4 artificial sweeteners, and they made a big point to say that there was glucose used in the sachets as a bulking agent. So some of you guys may not know, but if you look at like a package of, say, sucralose or aspartame or whatever, if you look in the packet, it'll actually say like glucose or maltodextrin. That is used as a bulking agent because the amount of non-nutritive sweetener you need is so small that it would be like just a couple granules. So you need to put in like a bulking agent with it. Otherwise, you'd be like checking to see if you've poured out like these few little granules into your coffee or whatever it is. So each person was consuming around 5 to 6 grams of glucose per day in addition to the non-nutritive sweeteners. So another good thing they did was they had a group that just consumed sachets of glucose to match the glucose intake of the other participants. Very, very smart. Good point, because if they hadn't done that, I would have called them on it. Then they also had another group that got no glucose and no non-nutritive sweeteners. So just kind of a completely basal control group, a control group that standardizes for the glucose, and then your test groups. And they consumed those for 2 weeks, and then they had a 1-week washout period as well. Now, what's funny is the people who love to dismiss data that does not fit with their bias, when they hear 2-week study, they go, oh, it's 2 weeks. Ah. The same people sending me this study like, see, artificial sweeteners or non-nutritive sweeteners are bad for you. It's like, well, what happened to the whole 2 weeks thing? Point is, for what the researchers were testing, I think 2 weeks was a reasonable period of time. They were looking at blood glucose responses, they were looking at insulin responses, they were looking at gut microbiome, which 2 weeks is typically enough time to see changes in the things they wanted to measure. Now, one of the things they measured, for example, was HbA1c, which didn't change in any group, which is not surprising because HbA1c, really you need at least kind of 3 months, if not more, to see differences in whatever you're testing. For their primary outcome data, the amount of time that they did the study, I think, was reasonable. So I'm not going to ding them on that. Now, obviously, if they could have done it for a longer period of time, great. But they didn't, and that's okay. And again, here's me, someone who has, I don't want to say defended non-nutritive sweeteners. I've just not allowed people to make claims about them based on nonsense. But here's me, who a lot of people would look at as a pro non-nutritive sweetener person saying, hey, the study duration is not something we can really ding them on because for what they wanted to test, it was totally fine. Even though the outcomes of the study may not be in favor with what I have previously said, but we're going to get to that. So they had them also wear continuous glucose monitors. And they did oral glucose tolerance tests where they challenged them with a load of oral glucose and then saw how long it takes to clear it. And they did a calculation called the incremental area under the curve of glucose, which is basically looking at what is the total area under the curve for the glucose response, which I think is one of the better ways to measure acute glycemic responses because one, you're measuring it in response to an actual challenge of glucose, and two, you're looking at the total area under the curve. You're not just looking at isolated time points. So I think that's a great thing to measure. Like I said, they looked at a lot of TCA cycle intermediates, and they looked at a lot of species of gut microbacteria. And one other really unique thing about this study was they took great care to only include people who had never used non-nutritive sweeteners. And they did a very thorough dietary recall to make sure that this was accurate. So for example, they had a lot of people volunteer. I think it was like 1,500 that they screened, but only about 130 were actually able to start the study because most of those people were unknowingly consuming non-nutritive sweeteners because it's in so many things. In some ways, it's a strength that they're doing that. Because when you have people who have never consumed them before, you can be sure that these acute effects that you're seeing are due to what you're doing in your study rather than things that may have happened previous to that. Here's the one big downside. For people to be able to say they've never consumed non-nutritive sweeteners, even unknowingly, because most people consume some unknowingly, I would say there's a high probability those people were purposefully avoiding non-nutritive sweeteners, likely because they feel that they are deleterious to health. Additionally, it's impossible to blind these people from knowing whether or not they're consuming glucose or non-nutritive sweeteners because like the first time you've ever had a Diet Coke, you're like, oh man, that tastes different than a regular Coke. So these people are going to know what they're taking in, and it's a probability that they already have a negative association with those non-nutritive sweeteners. Now I'll get into a few kind of limitations of the study and criticisms a bit later, but let's go through the results. So looking at the oral glucose tolerant tests and the incremental area under the curve of blood glucose, they did see an increase in blood glucose with sucralose and saccharin. Now it was a pretty modest increase. It wasn't very big, but it was a difference that was statistical. Stevia and aspartame had no effect on blood glucose. What's interesting is they did not see an increase in insulin nor an increase in GLP-1 in any of these groups. So that was interesting. Here's where I'm going to get into some criticisms. The participants were wearing continuous glucose monitors, and the oral glucose tolerance tests were not performed by the researchers. They were not supervised by the researchers. They gave the subjects kits and instructions on how to do the oral glucose tolerance tests. To me, this is a major problem. The reason being, this is one of your primary outcome pieces of data. It's literally in the title. Glucose tolerance is in the title. And you left it to people to do at home on their own accord. The pushback would be, well, they're wearing continuous glucose control monitors. They were given specific instructions, and they were given the solutions of glucose to just take, that sort of thing. I don't really care. When it's your primary outcome data, that needs to be supervised, in my opinion. Because if you've got people who have been specifically avoiding non-nutritive sweeteners for basically their entire lives, it's likely they have a negative perception of them, and they cannot be blinded to it. They know, the people who are taking in probably know they are taking it, and in that group, what is to stop them from taking the glucose solution as well as a little bit extra? Now, am I saying that happened? I don't know. I don't know what happened. That's the point. You don't know because the researchers did not supervise it. These results could be completely legitimate, but unfortunately, because they had them do them from home, to me, it really calls into question the legitimacy of the results from the glycemic response. Is there any reason it shouldn't have worked? No. But I just know how much care we took on testing days when we were looking at human data. There was so much care taken to make sure we got it right, because it's so easy to get it wrong. Even when you have the researchers there, letting people do it on their own just introduces all kinds of potential sources of error. So to me, I have a real problem with this glycemic data because I just don't know if we can trust it, especially because there's no differences in insulin. Like, how does that happen? I guess you could say, well, somehow it raised their blood glucose but must have blunted their insulin. I'd be interested to see the mechanism behind that. I'm not saying that this stuff happened. I'm just saying, unfortunately, since they weren't supervised, you can't be sure. And the other thing is, placebo, the power of placebo is very real. We know this. We know that the power of suggestion, the power of a pre-existing belief can actually change your physiology. It is completely plausible that people who had completely avoided non-nutritive sweeteners because they thought they were bad for them, if they're now taking them in, that they're actually having somewhat of a stress response to taking them in because they're worried about what it's doing to their body potentially. If you're having a stress response and elevate your cortisol, you can absolutely elevate your blood glucose as well. Now again, they didn't measure cortisol, so we don't know that for sure. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying we don't know, but it is a plausible explanation for what we're seeing here. Finally, let's say that this data is all legitimate and my criticisms are things that we don't need to be worried about. They didn't happen, those sorts of things. That's totally fine. And by the way, I do think this study overall is pretty darn good. Every study has limitations. I'm not trying to dog it. I'm just really wanting to point out that as a piece of primary outcome data, this should have been supervised by the researchers, in my opinion. But let's say all my criticisms are wrong and this data is completely legitimate, totally fine. It's 14 days, and so we have to keep it all in balance with the consensus of the data, which there are meta-analyses now demonstrating that when you compare non-nutritive sweeteners to sugar-sweetened beverages, non-nutritive sweeteners improve glycemia, they lower blood glucose, they reduce body weight, and they have several positive effects on hard health outcomes. And even when you substitute non-nutritive sweeteners for water, there was a network meta-analysis that looked at this that showed, compared to water, non-nutritive sweeteners had a slight effect on lowering body weight, and they did not make any measures of glycemic control worse. So okay, you've got this continuous glucose monitor on over the course of 14 days. You see some effects on postprandial blood glucose. Okay, but it doesn't seem, at least as of yet, to show up in long-term assessments of glycemia. It does not seem to affect long-term glycemia based on the outcome data from human randomized control trials, and I'll link a bunch of them in the description. Not saying it's not wrong, I'm just saying when we go to the actual randomized control trials in humans where they look at hard outcomes like body weight, HbA1c, insulin sensitivity, they don't see decrements when using non-nutritive sweeteners compared to sugar-sweetened beverages especially, and even water, and they see reductions in body weight and improvements in health markers, especially when substituted for sugar-sweetened beverages. So again, am I saying that you should go out and drink beverages sweetened with non-nutritive sweeteners rather than just water? No, I'm not saying that. But if you're somebody who really struggles with sweet tooth and drinking sodas, I can tell you that taking in non-nutritive sweeteners a hell of a lot better than drinking regular soda or sugar-sweetened beverages. And that is clear based on the long-term hard outcome human randomized control trials. So again, not saying this stuff doesn't matter at all. I'm just saying we need to keep it in the proper perspective. On balance, non-nutritive sweeteners in the long term show positive effects on glycemia when substituted for sugar-sweetened beverages, and even when compared to water, don't appear to have negative effects on glycemia in the long term. And I'm just trying to reconcile the difference in these data sets because this is showing an effect, whereas long-term stuff doesn't. Perhaps there's an initial adaptation period with things like sucralose or saccharin, and then once you've become adapted to it, you don't have that increase in glycemic response. So they measured a bunch of metabolites as well as a bunch of different species of bacteria from the gut microbiome and did see changes. Now this is where it gets really tricky because people say, oh my gosh, their gut microbiome changed. That's a bad thing. We don't know. We do know that if you change almost any aspect of your diet, your gut microflora will change. It's very responsive. What we don't know is whether or not that change is a good or bad change. And I'll give you an example. So from the paper, they said there were 22 metabolites that were correlated with an increase in the area under the curve of glucose. Okay? So basically, the people consuming these non-nutritive sweeteners had higher levels of these metabolites, and that was correlated with their increase in glycemic response. So these metabolites should be bad, right? Well, the metabolites were the short-chain fatty acids propionate, butyrate, and valerate. So I looked up, and I'll link some studies in the description. When they supplement people with propionate and butyrate, they actually get better effects on glycemic response. And they appear to have some other beneficial impacts as well. So again, we're balancing, all right, you're shifting to forms of gut microbiota that produce more butyrate and propionate, but is that necessarily a bad thing? This paper kind of is saying, well, maybe it's a bad thing, but then we've got other papers saying, no, it's a good thing. We just don't know enough about the gut microbiome to really be able to say for sure, and that's why I continue to default to what does the hard, long-term human outcome data say for non-nutritive sweeteners, and right now it's favorable. So another example of this is in the aspartame group, B. fragilis was positively associated with the increase in the area under the curve of blood glucose. Okay, well that must mean B. fragilis is bad, and giving aspartame increases that particular bacteria, and so that's why we don't want aspartame. Except when you look at the research on B. fragilis, there's some research showing it actually decreases intestinal inflammation. So it seems to have some positive effects as well. So again, all this to say, we just do not know enough about the gut microbiome to be able to make some of these strong statements. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do more research on this stuff. We absolutely should. But again, when I make recommendations, I am looking at the consensus of the data. We have quite a few studies out there on non-nutritive sweeteners and hard health outcomes like body weight, body fat, HbA1c, and a whole host of other hard endpoint markers. Until I see evidence that non-nutritive sweeteners are negatively affecting those in the long term, I'm going to continue to say that non-nutritive sweeteners are a reasonable tool for people to use. Am I saying they're metabolically inert? It doesn't appear so. It doesn't appear that we can say that they're metabolically inert. But we don't know if that's a bad thing or a good thing. Right now, on balance, I would say it doesn't appear to go either way, although hard human outcome data would suggest they're positive, but mostly because people just consume less calories. Is this paper a negative for non-nutritive sweeteners? I suppose a little bit. When I saw the title and I saw how many people were sending it to me, I was like, oh man, this seems like it's going to be really bad. But again, once you read the full text of the paper, I'm like, okay, well, they saw some modest differences in glycemia in a couple of the groups, but then when you go dig through the data a little bit more and you look at the hard human outcome data, it doesn't seem to line up with those long-term outcomes that we're seeing. So it could be that this is simply an initial response during those first few weeks of consuming a brand new element to the diet that these people have never seen before. Again, they never consumed these before. And then the body adjusts, and now there's no difference, in 10, 12, however many weeks. That could explain the difference between the short-term data and the long-term data, but we just don't know. We obviously need more studies on this. Hopefully, they'll repeat a study like this in a population of people who have already been consuming non-nutritive sweeteners, and hopefully they'll do more research in people who have never used them. I don't want to ding the study for using that population because I think that's a reasonable question to ask. The downside is to how that's going to be interpreted by the mainstream media and many of you. And again, if people have never consumed them, because they're in so many things, that suggests that they were purposely avoiding them. And you cannot discount the power of placebo. They have shown that the power of suggestion, the power of placebo, can be just as powerful as actual pharmaceutical drugs in some cases. Many people will say, oh, well, you can't placebo me because look, they're actually showing differences in blood glucose. Placebo is not a feeling. Sure, you can be placeboed and think you're feeling something that's not actually happening. But they've shown that placebo actually can affect physiology. When your brain believes something to be true, it can actually affect the physiological outcomes. So again, a plausible explanation to this is that these folks were more stressed by consuming non-nutritive sweeteners because they've been avoiding them and they think they're bad for them. And so they have some kind of stress response and that raises their blood glucose. That could be complete hogwash. I'm not sure. But the point is, this specific population we need to keep in mind when we're analyzing this paper, because this is a brand new population that's never really been assessed before when it comes to non-nutritive sweeteners. My take home here is if you are consuming non-nutritive sweeteners just for the heck of it and you don't mind drinking water and you don't have any cravings for, soda or whatnot, then okay, you can just do water, fine. But if you're somebody who these specific non-nutritive sweeteners have allowed you to consume less calories by cutting out sugar-sweetened beverages, I would not cut them out based on this study. I don't think the data is nearly strong enough for that. And again, on balance, looking at the long-term, hard human health outcome data, they seem to be a net positive. All right, guys, hope you liked this video. If you like deep dives like this into research studies, make sure you check out REPS, which is research explained with practical summaries. We do breakdowns like this for 5 studies each month. We put it into a format that's palatable for anybody, even if you don't have a science background, and we give you practical takeaways about what it means for you, your nutrition, your training, and we don't bog you down with a bunch of unnecessary jargon. So if you guys are interested in REPS, make sure you click the link in the description. It's only $12.99 a month, and you get access to our entire backlog of issues as well. So if you're looking to take your knowledge to the next level, don't miss out on that, and I will catch you guys next week.